Hello, I'm Beynon. I'm the rector of Stoke Prior, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the church, picking out some of the key features, some of the things you'll find in just about every church, but every church is also unique, and I'm going to show you one or two things that are perhaps only to be found in Stoke Prior. I'm going to start with that now, and we're going to move out to the porch because the best place to start is on the way in. So here we are in the porch. The porch isn't particularly old, it's Victorian. There was a porch here before, which is now our lich gate, which before it was our porch was also our lich gate, and it's been brought here and put back where it belongs. But we have a modern, well no, Victorian stone porch. Victorian that is, except for this. This is a Saxon stone, and it's the oldest thing in Stoke Prior, and makes it sort of, well, not unique, but a little unusual. It tells us we know that this church is not the first church on this site, that there was a Saxon church here, and this stone is all that's left of it. So Saxon, that means before the Norman conquest, so we're looking at the 900s, 800s, 700s. And we know from the churchyard this is a very ancient site. So if you go back 1,200 years, there was probably a wooden church here with bits of stone being used in the construction, and that's one of them. So it tells you whatever we're doing here, it's been going on a very long time. So we'll go in and have a look at the font, which will really introduce us to what churches are all about. This is our font, and it's by the door, and it's by the door because the font is where we do baptisms or christenings, and that's how you join the church. You become, as it were, a member by baptism, so it's on the way in. And traditionally, on the left of the porch, you will find fonts all over the place in a church, but this is in a very traditional position. It's a medieval piece of stone with some very ancient lead in it, and in the medieval times this would have been full of water and left full of water from week to week, and babies would have just been dipped in it. As you can imagine, that wasn't a very healthy thing to do. These days we make sure it's clean water every time. But the font is a key thing in every church. It's the place that signifies joining and belonging. And so you'll find one of these somewhere in every church. So now we're at the other end of the church, the east end, and we call it the east end whether it's the east end or not. It's the liturgical or architectural east end of the church, which in this particular church really is at the east end. But in modern churches, they could be pointing in any geographical direction, but we'd still call this end the east end. And you see a big window, and of course stained glass windows are a feature of many churches. This particular window is not ancient, it's Victorian. It depicts the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, either side of Jesus, standing there with a chalice, because this is the place of Holy Communion. And you'll see the big table, which is uncovered at the moment. Normally it has a brocade front, but this allows us to see something unusual about this particular altar. Most modern churches would have a wooden altar. This indeed has a wooden base, but it's got a stone top, which is quite unusual, but is very ancient. We know it's an altar, it's properly inscribed, and it was put here to be an altar stone. It's nice to be able to see that, because even regulars don't ever see that, because it's covered in our frontals and linen. Behind the altar is what we call the Riridos. And in every church there will be something to give a backdrop. In this case, it's a beautiful wooden screen. It's a crucifixion scene, and either side of Jesus on the cross we have John, who wrote John's Gospel, known as the beloved disciple. There was a special relationship between John and Jesus. And we have Mary, that's Mary's, as in Jesus' mother, Mary. Sometimes you'll also have another Mary, Mary Magdalene, but in this one it's a classic three-character depiction of the crucifixion. And what it shows is Jesus saying to John and Mary, well, he says to John, behold your mother, and to Mary, behold your son. He basically makes John look after his mother because he knows he's going to die. But that actually is the first church, is John and Mary. And the meal of the church is Holy Communion, which we use the altar for. And here John is holding the chalice, the cup of wine. But also he's a gospel writer, and so he's holding a book which says love one another, which is a key phrase that John repeats many times. And you'll see this crucifixion scene in many ways in churches, sometimes in stained glass, sometimes actually in statue form, often on top of a screen. We haven't got one to show you here. So that's common to many churches, but this is St. Michael and All Angels Church, and here we have St. Michael, and you think, well, he doesn't look much like an angel, he just looks like a boat with a spear. And when this particular Riridos was being made and proposed, they wouldn't give permission at first. Well, you know, angels should have wings, and this character should have a wing. But the artist persisted, and in the end, it was allowed. And he's quite right, because actually angels anciently didn't have wings. In the Old Testament, they were just messengers, people who appeared with a message from God. So I'm rather pleased that our St. Michael hasn't got wings. And if you come to the other side, there's a woman standing, holding a book, but also this curious contraption in her hand. This is St. Catherine. St. Catherine was an early Christian saint who was martyred. And she was martyred on a horrible thing, which was basically a rack, really. She was crucified on a wheel, which stretched her, but it broke. And the sparks flew off and hurt all the people who were trying to torture her. Not a very nice story. And in the end, they beheaded her because they'd broken the machine. It's a Catherine wheel, and that's where we get the firework name from. So, something very common in churches, the crucifixion scene in this form, but special to us, St. Michael and All Angels, which is what the church is called, but it's actually called St. Michael and All Angels with St. Catherine. And where our organ is now used to be the St. Catherine Chapel, but there's no room anymore to use it as a chapel. And this is very medieval. I mean, I had one I could use in my last church. I used to pour the water down there, but I've never used this. But,
yeah, whenever you're ready.
Just by the altar are these wonderful recesses in the wall. First of all, let's look at this one. And if you look inside, there's what looks like a little sink with a hole, because that's what it is. It's a Latin name, piscina, and basically this is where the priest would wash his hands and pour dirty water, and the plug hole goes to earth outside. Somebody at some point put a table, a shelf halfway up for putting things, which is quite handy. Unfortunately, the stonework here is very worn, so we can't actually use it. But the priest and those helping him would have sat on this, which is called a sedilia. The priest would have sat in the middle, and the servers would have sat either side. And just to make the priest look absolutely beautiful, they've put a couple of horrible gargoyles either side. Very crude. I think they were very crude when they were new, and they certainly look awful now. I suspect the priest, who was probably even dodgier than I am, would have held on to them as he sat down, and then held on to them as he stood up, and it's just worn away. But to me, they're just like a couple of Homer Simpsons, really. They're not beautiful, but actually, I'm very fond of them. So we started at the back of the church where we came in with the font. We went to the other end, to the east end, and looked at the window and the altar and the Riridos. But now I've come back down more or less in the middle, and here I've got a couple of steps down. So there's a real change in level here, because actually the church has got two main parts. I'm being filmed from what's called the nave, but I'm standing in what's called the chancel. And this divide, these steps, are called the chancel steps. And the division is really quite important, because the high bit up here, the chancel, is where Holy Communion will be celebrated. And this was the kind of sanctuary in the church. But the nave, where everybody stood, and they would have stood in the Middle Ages, is for everybody. And this was the public space. And if you look round the church now, you see it full of chairs. But actually in the Middle Ages, it would have been where the market would have been. All the animals would have been brought in, bought and sold. This was a place of refuge. This was the community centre. When funds are a bit short, they set up a brewery at the back and made a weak beer, or small beer, and that's where that term comes from. This is not a place that's divorced from everyday life. The nave was for everybody, and everything went on there, and that's why they kept this bit a bit special. But there's an interface between the two. Sometimes there's a screen at this point, and ours has been taken away a long time ago. But the interface is really important. The two are not divorced. They are together under the church. And it's called the nave. I don't know if you can pan up to look at our lovely barrel ceiling. But if you were to take that ceiling off and turn it up the other way, it would look like the keel of a church. Or in Latin, navus, where we get the word navy from. And that's why we call this the nave. And it's like a big ship. It's for everybody. It's an encompassing, it's an ark, as it were, thinking of Noah's Ark, for everybody. And it's a shame that in the 1700s particularly, we tried to make the place all holy and kicked out all the ordinary things that should be going on inside the nave. So the chancel step is a significant thing. It says the holy and the ordinary are butted together in one place. They're not things that happen in separate locations, but happen together. And what did you do about the animals? Well, you remember all things bright and beautiful. You gathered your rushes every day and you strewed them all over the floor. And after the animals were gone, you swept them up, and that took all the poo and the stuff and chucked them out in the churchyard, and you put fresh straw down and rushes to keep the place clean. And Was it cold in here? No, it wasn't. There would have been a couple of braziers full of smoke, and the walls would have been painted psychedelic colours. It would have been fantastic. But thanks to the Puritans, we washed it all down and got rid of them and made it all a bit clinical. I think that's sad, but that's just me. So we've moved back up into the choir, which is part of the chancel. And well, because of the work we've got going on here, the organ is behind that plastic covering. And it's there in what actually was the Catherine Chapel. But that's a political statement, that organ. You go back 200 years, there was no organ here. The music was provided by the village band. But as tastes changed and people got rather wealthier towards the end of the 18th century, organs became a bit of a status symbol. And certainly by the Victorian times, every church worth its salt would have wanted to have an organ. There's a problem with that. You then made 6, 10, 12 people redundant. They didn't want the sackbut and lute and the serpent and all those wonderful medieval instruments that would have been used in worship. And so it was just professionalized to one organist. There would still have been a choir of sorts, and then during the Victorian times everybody thought, well, the proper way to do it is to pretend that we're a little cathedral, and we'll buy all the choir cassocks and surplices and make them dress up. And so certainly between the 1600s and the 1900s, there's huge political change from worship being something that was shared with everybody in the village, with everybody who could play anything, being in the band, people singing just because they could sing. But we professionalized it. We had an organist and a trained choir who dressed up smartly. We're going back the other way now, and worship bands long been a feature of worship, and choirs that are robed are not so common. But it isn't modern. It's actually going back to what happened for hundreds of years. Having said that, organs are wonderful instruments, and organists are people I greatly admire. We actually have the best of both worlds today. If we come back to the chancel steps, there's two things that you will find in many, many churches. The first one is the pulpit, and the other one is the lectern. We've got a classic arrangement here. At the pulpit is just a place for the vicar to stand and preach. It puts you 4 feet above contradiction, but it does mean you can project your voice all the way to the back, and that's really why it's up on high. To be honest, with PA systems now, I very rarely stand in the pulpit to preach because I don't need to. But it is a practical arrangement so that people can hear you at the back. And that's all there is to it. On the other hand, we have the lectern. Classically, a lectern is a big piece of furniture that holds the Bible. And this is where the Bible is read from. And in fact, in my case, I often stand here to preach because it's got a microphone and it's all ready to go. The eagle is the greatest of birds, and it carries the message on its back, and it's always on a ball, which is the globe. So it's carrying the Gospel. And I like to think of it as St. John, because the four Gospel writers each have an image. And in the window we saw earlier, each of them have their image. So St. Matthew is a man, but St. Luke is an ox, St. Mark is a lion, and St. John is an eagle. So I like to think of it as John the evangelist, the gospel writer, and the gospel is taken to the whole world. So there's a simple but quite profound piece of symbolism in the lectern. So the lectern and the pulpit are where we read scripture and preach the gospel. So the word, and at the altar earlier at the East End we celebrate what we call the sacrament of Holy Communion. So word and sacrament. Sacrament is something that is holy. Word and sacrament. And the word is the message, as it were, is what joins the ordinary everyday in the nave to the holy in the sanctuary, in the chancel. But it's not somewhere else. It's right with the everyday. We thought as we came into church of that Saxon stone. And I'm often asked, how old is the church? And I always answer, well, it depends which bit you're looking at. If we go to the foundations of this building, they're 12th century. That's the 1100s. That's the century after William the Conqueror arrived, and a whole new piece of history on these islands began. Together with a lot of building, and the Normans built a lot of churches. And you can always tell a Norman church because they liked semicircular arches, as you can see behind me. And when the Victorians came along, they tended to think of ancient architecture not as having semicircular arches, but having pointy arches. But I'm delighted that when they refurbished these arches, they put them back in the original Norman style. But on the other side, and I'm just going to move round now, you can see some pointy arches, and that's called Early English. That's the architectural term for it. And the Victorians tended to think of Gothic having as pointy, and if you think of neo-Gothic art and the way the Victorians built houses for themselves, they rather liked the pointy arch. Personally, I prefer the Norman ones. I'm standing next to this effigy of what is believed to be one of my predecessors. I hope I don't end up looking like this chap, although there are one or two people think I probably do already. This effigy used to be in the floor just here, apparently, until only about 30 or 40 years ago. And he was getting into a bit of a mess. The story was that they piled coke on top of him, ready to put in the old turtle stove to keep everybody warm, and as they scraped it off, they damaged it. I think that's a bit of a story, but I like it. But he was obviously a much loved incumbent in the Middle Ages, because after he died, he was probably buried just where I'm standing, and this effigy was put on top of him. Well, I imagine he was much loved. They either put it there because they loved him very much, or they didn't want him to come back out. But it would have been much nicer when it was original. But why it's got quite so worn is an interesting question. And of course, the way we commemorate people has changed over the centuries. He would have been quite special for them to have bothered to make an effigy of him. Most people were buried in a winding sheet and put in the ground, and that was that. No memorial at all. And in a moment we're going to go out into the churchyard and have a little think about what that can tell us today. So we've come outside into the churchyard, and we saw that effigy of one of my predecessors, and we thought about how we remember those who've gone before us. And there are a few 18th centuries, from the 1700s, stones, and that's when headstones really became common. As people became generally wealthier, ordinary people started to think, oh, I can afford to put a headstone. At least the ordinary gentry. The workers probably couldn't afford it. But as the 18th century gave way to the Victorian times, then actually many people were able to get a headstone, and that was a completely new thing. And the churchyard, as we see it today, is very modern. Up until 200 years ago, it would have been just grass. Only the very highest status people in society would have had stone memorials. But now everyone can have one. Across this part of our churchyard, which in this churchyard is a conservation area, it starts in January with the snowdrops and crocuses. We've had daffodils, and now we've got the bluebells. And you'll see lots of crosses of different shapes. Very Victorian. You'd think that the church, that Christians would always have had crosses, but actually the earliest stones are not. So this was again an indication of wealth as society got richer, and also a kind of romanticised view, because many of these are actually Celtic crosses, which is quite interesting. Now, why? Because there was a romantic part to the Victorians, and religion for Victorians in some ways became quite sentimental. Something you'll find in many, indeed most ancient churchyard, is a yew tree, and it's here for many reasons. First of all, in an ancient churchyard like this, you're looking at something that's pre-Christian, and if you were to look down from above, you'd see that this churchyard is an oval shape, and that suggests that it's pre-Christian, and yew trees were part of pre-Christian worship for the ancient Britons. But it's also useful because bigger animals like cattle and that shouldn't be eating it, so it was a good way of making sure they didn't graze the grass, although sheep and goats are very useful grazers, but I don't think they worry about the yew, although someone might correct me about that. Also, the yew is what you use to make longbows. And that's another reason they were grown in churchyards, that they were a ready source for longbows for weaponry. And it's still the law that all men should spend Sunday afternoon practicing archery in the churchyard. And if you don't, you break the law. The law has never been repealed. So this yew has got a big story of its own, particularly this one, because our county tree specialist tells us this one's 1,200 years old, which presumably means that when it was a little sapling, it could have been looked on by a Viking as they arrived across the North Sea, except we're not that close to the North Sea. But there's two of them. There's the one here, and if we pan across, its neighbour is there, and they're both 1,200 years old. And that takes us back in history. But I want to take you further back than that, because if you look behind me, you might be able to see that there's a fairly sudden change of level at the churchyard fence. And down the meadow is a river, and that river has meandered across its valley And what should have been an oval churchyard, in fact, has been cut off almost in a straight line as it's meandered and taken all those bodies down the Sole Warp into the River Severn and out into the Bristol Channel. And that reminds us that in this case there's a geology and a story that is prehistoric, because what we're actually standing on is the seabed of a Triassic sea that dried up, caused a salt pan, and the salt millions of years later was extracted by well, in prehistoric times the Romans extracted it, and then this chap, John Corbett, came to this village and he created a huge salt and chemical industry based on the salt that's underground. He built the village, he provided the money to renew the church in Victorian times, and he's buried here in great grandeur with a big stone, marble with a surround. And just to make sure that you kept an order of these things, he's got the big stone and his younger brother is on the other side, but that's not quite so grand. John Corbett was a remarkable character, Member of Parliament. He supposedly improved the working conditions for salt workers, and I think particularly for women too in his own time. But it reminds us of the fact that the church and the community and the industry, the thing that made the money, all these things are linked together. Their stories are interwoven. And this churchyard reminds us that what we do today, it was possible because millions of years ago a salt sea dried up and created the salt pan that we exploited in the Victorian times. Thank you for taking time to listen to me as I've shown you just a tiny little bit of what can be discovered in any church and churchyard in any village in this country. The story is unique to Stoke Prior, and yet it has common themes in every community across our land. There are 16,000 churches like this in England alone. And if you look behind me, you can see St Michael's Church. It was started certainly by the Saxons, continued by the Normans, and look, we haven't quite finished it yet. The tower hopefully will be revealed in the next few weeks after its renovation. The spire will be revealed, and the story goes on. We're standing on ground that was formed millions of years ago. It has a story that is prehistoric. We don't know when the burial started here. It takes us through the Christian era right up to the present day. It's an amazing story, but it's not a museum. It's not simply about the past. It's a place of today and the future. It's a place of worship. It's a place of hope. And as I like to say, churchyards are not miserable places. There are places where you can be sad. Being sad is healthy. Being miserable isn't. But there are also places full of life, absolutely bursting with new life and new hope. And that's really why the Christian faith has survived so long, because it brings that hope. And that's what the building stands for, as a witness. So thank you very much.